Now, a social experiment enterprise.
Welcome to Stop Now. I'm Nate.
Hello there, I'm Melissa, and we're back with a new story for this week's talk show.
Yes, and as usual, we're bringing you interesting news updates from around the world.
That's great. So, what do we have for them today?
Well, Melissa, on today's episode, we continue with an issue that we've been talking about almost all of our talk shows, But today's segment, we're going to take a little bit of a different spin on it. It's going to be a lot different than every other segment that we've been having so far on the show.
So, what's different about today?
I am glad you asked, Melissa. And I know the people out there are glad that you asked as well, because this issue, usually we talk about the issue of the H-1B visa here on the show.
Mhm.
And mostly we've been talking about the effects and how it's made life difficult for so many foreigners that are under this immigration plan, and also how the immigration has affected some of the locals as well.
Okay, that's true, but you still haven't told me about what's different today.
It's called suspense, Melissa. I gotta play it out a little bit. I gotta play it out for the folks out there, because on today's
All right now.
episode, we'll be having a much closer look at some of the victim stories. And, over the week, we gathered several stories from folks that have fallen victim to this type of immigration plan and the effects that it's had on them, the effects that it's had on their work as well as their family. And so you might want to buckle up, folks, put your safety belts on, make sure, because we are going to get ready for a roller coaster ride this week.
All right now.
All right. So usually, Melissa, we protect the identity of the individuals involved. As I mentioned, you know, these stories have already been published in articles. So first, before we even get into that, because we could talk about their original identities, but before we get into that, let's bring in a very special guest of the show who will help us all understand the problems that we are facing here, and will give us some solutions as well. Yes, that's right. We made the arrangements, we made the calls. Our team has invited several attorneys and law firms, along with experts in the field, to help us with interesting facts, and they agreed to help us graciously. Yes, I am proud to announce to our guests, to our folks out there, our first guest here on the show. Uh, she is an immigration attorney, and we are so pleased and so thankful to have Miss Dinumaru joining us here on the show.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here.
Absolutely. Like, we are so glad to have you, because, the listeners have had questions about some of these topics involving immigration. And so we're glad that we could bring you on to kind of straighten some things out. So, first of all, can you help us by introducing ourselves, and maybe a little bit about what you do, so the listeners can get familiar with you?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Danu Maru. I'm an immigration lawyer in Chicago, Illinois. I work with clients all across the U.S. And we work with employment-based visas. We work with also some of the individual issues, there that intersect all different kinds of visas. And we're talking about here employment abuse, family domestic abuse,
Mm.
immigration and crimes. I mean, those are things that I think, regardless of what visa an individual may be on, or even if they have, no status, they would be faced with some of these issues. And I'm happy to discuss more about them on your show as it pertains to your viewers.
Now, Daniel, before we take a step forward and talk about some of the stories that we have to go over this week, can we take a step back, for the listeners' benefit, as well as for the benefit of myself and Melissa, and kind of, go step by step? And first of all, can you kind of explain to the folks out there what exactly is the H-1B visa?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So H-1B visa is an employer-employee visa. Just to give you some context, United States of America is one of the only developed countries where a person who's looking for an employment-based visa first has to have a job. They have to have a job offered to them before they can come. So they can't come here to look for a job.
Okay.
And this is something that's very unique about us. So an H-1B visa is an employer-employee visa. The employee already has a job offered to them by an employer, and they're coming here specific, or they're coming here, or they're changing their status specifically to work for that particular employer. So it's not suitable for example, independent contractors. It's not suitable for people who are looking to work for multiple employers without having multiple employers sponsor them. So it is very specific in its scope. It also requires that the employee be hired for a specialty occupation. Now, this has been the topic of numerous litigations in the history. What is considered a specialty occupation? Loosely speaking, it is an occupation that requires the minimum of a bachelor's degree in a specific area. So we're definitely, with H-1B, we're looking at potential employees with a minimum of a bachelor's degree or higher, and they're working in professions in that particular area.
Well, thank you for that explanation. I'm sure it has kind of helped the listeners kind of get a bigger grasp on the subject matter that we're dealing with this week. So Melissa, obviously, we have got a subject matter expert in the house. So let's go ahead and roll the dice and proceed with our first story this week.
All right. This is the story of a victim recorded by our team. As per the statement, I joined this company in the year 2016 after transferring my H-1B visa from the previous employer who was not paying me salary and abusing the system. After the visa transfer, the employer started exploiting me by not running my payroll on time and putting me on a different project location with different offer letters every time. I was not paid on time, and by delaying the filing of I-9 form to recover visa transfer costs for my project payment, they started to pay me only after I reported the violations. When I am not in the project, running the payroll and keeping the salary with them is a regular practice. I reported to the Department of Labor in 3 different states where I worked. But I was threatened by their legal team to withdraw my complaint and settle the amount. Then they came up with a plan to create a fake company to keep me in the project all the time and filed the amended petition accordingly and asked me to pay money to the company every month from May 2017 to September 2018 to keep my H-1B status active. I was terminated from employment for reporting to USCIS investigator on violations of filing amended petitions and not paying me on time. I was working at the client site in Texas during the period 2017, but after I moved to New York State in 2018 for a different client, they refused to file the amendment and pay me accordingly to the agreement. They forced me to give a leave letter for a 2-month period stating that I traveled to India so that I cannot be paid. As they continued to threaten to withdraw the petition, if I do not comply to pay money through their client company to run the payroll and keep the status, I agreed to do so to collect evidence and prove the violations to the authorities. They terminated my employment in September 2018 since I refused to pay their company money to continue with this illegal activity due to the hope of USCIS investigator who reached out about the investigation of my employer for violations, which was filed in April 2017. But to my surprise, no legal action was taken and they told me to file a complaint with DOL. Though I was terminated from employment, they tried to settle with me and kept asking me to join back and avoid further legal complications. They even challenged that nothing can be done to prosecute them since I was involved in it. After reporting it to DOL, they withdrew my visa petition, which is about to expire in a month by default if not filed for extension. They refused to pay me for almost 6 months and forced me to agree their business practices. Even after more than a year of investigation, the DOL investigator cannot do anything about this company. With the help of their attorney, they argued and convinced the special investigator that I am not eligible for compensation and I did not work for them.
Thank you, Melissa. Now, before we continue with another victim story, let's stop and analyze this present story and bring out some of the effects, shall we? Okay, so from the story that we just heard, which of the main problems can you kind of pick out from that, Melissa?
How can the company mistreat her so long and threatens to withdraw her petition and terminate employment if she failed to comply with the rules they had put in place for her? Even after she complained to the authorities about the treatments from the companies, she was threatened by their legal team to withdraw the complaint and settle the amount. This is the major problem of H-1B visa, as in this case, how she was forced to work without pay.
Exactly. So now let's ask some questions to our viewers and to our guests.
What is the role of DOL, DOJ, DHS, and USCIS?
That's a very big question, and it's a good one because each of these agencies play a different role. The DOL, the Department of Labor, they play a role of determining minimum wage requirements. So actually, it's kind of interesting because I do believe that the H-1B visa was originally designed with, some safeguards in mind. And this is one of the safeguards, is that the Department of Labor has set, certain wages that have to be paid to anybody who's on an H-1B, regardless of whether they have a project or not at that time. So that is called that concept is called the prevailing wage. That's what the DOL does. Now, the DHS, or the Department of Homeland Security, they're like the big umbrella overseeing organization for activities within the US, right? Everything in the homeland. And what they are the parent company for USCIS. That's another, it's like a whole alphabet soup, right? So that's another agency, which is where you would file affirmative applications for different kinds of visas. So your H-1Bs are filed with USCIS, and the USCIS is directly under the DHS. The DHS is the one to investigate to make sure that they're eligible for the relief that they're seeking, that also that they meet the bare minimum that we require in the country for good moral character and other issues. So that is the DHS. And the DOJ, the Department of Justice, their responsibility is to make sure that the implementation of some of these rules are done in a proper, lawful, constitutional way. And so it's a system of different divisions of different tasks, and they all work together in order to make a visa a reality. So for an H-1B visa, the first application that's filed is actually with the Department of Labor. It's called a labor conditions application, and that's where you declare what is their wage level going to be. So essentially, it sounds like in this case, the company declared a certain wage level for this employee. It was approved for that wage level, but then they violated it.
So in a situation like this, who would be responsible for, handling those violations and making sure that the worker is protected?
It would be the Department of Labor.
And so, how does the investigation process take place? Like if this worker were to want to escalate this and get justice, what would that process look like?
Sure. So this is an interesting question that you asked me, Nate, because there were, and when we talk about laws, we have different categories of laws here that were violated. Mm-hmm. There were clear labor violations. And I'm an immigration attorney. I can speak to the immigration violations, but a labor attorney would jump all over this and talk about all the labor law violations that happened. Right. So there were clear labor law violations, because you can't, in this country, slavery has been outlawed. You cannot make somebody work for 6 months without pay. It's just not done. Right. So there are huge labor law violations that I think, an individual like this, I would refer them to a labor law attorney. First thing. Okay. Second thing, there were contract violations, because this company entered into an agreement, whether it was verbal or written. They entered into an agreement with this employee. This employee agreed to work with them under certain terms. Those terms were clearly not upheld, right? So there were also contract violations, and there were immigration violations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the immigration violations, because in the immigration law system, they violated their agreement with the Department of Labor, what they put out in the LCA, right? The labor conditions application. They're not allowed to do that. They're also not allowed to, have an employee working under the H-1B visa without meeting those minimum wage level requirements and without disclosing to the government. So there was a disclosure violation here, because they didn't disclose that this employee is not being paid, because otherwise he wouldn't be able to retain that visa at all, right?
Right.
So they didn't disclose the actual wage level. So there was There was definitely some misrepresentation to the government here. They also were not allowed to be on H-1B visa and work in different sites unless there are certain formal paperwork filed with the USCIS. And I'm guessing, although this isn't clearly talked about here, but I'm guessing that was not probably done. So there are those violations. Now, the interesting thing, and I don't know if you want me to go into this at some point, but the interesting thing is that there is a visa developed in the USCIS system for people who are victims of such violations.
So we definitely want to touch on that a little bit later, but I guess this particular story, how frequent would you estimate like this occurs? Because, you know, Melissa and I have talked about stories like this for the past few weeks, and, you know, I want to maybe give the listeners a picture of how widespread this is and how serious, you know, the problems like these are.
It's serious for sure. I don't know if I'm in the right position to give you like the broad overview of how frequently it occurs, because obviously people only come to attorneys to solve problems. So if there's no issue,
Right.
there's no problems, nobody's going to an attorney, right? So we get a very filtered set of people that we speak to and that we work with. And oftentimes we work with employers because we help employers to file H-1B visas, and we relay these rules to them, what they have to follow. So I don't know if I know from my own experience, if I can speak to like a big picture.
I definitely appreciate, you know, the perspective that you have, because it's a perspective that I don't have, or Melissa or our listeners. Most of our listeners wouldn't have that type of perspective either. So we really appreciate. So let's move on to our next story. You know, we're going to look at another victim.
Sorry, Nate, to cut you off short. We're running out of time.
No problem, Melissa. You have become the timekeeper, and I appreciate that. You know, we have to value the listeners and guest time as well. The folks out there, the listeners, and the viewers, want to extend a gracious thank you to Ms. Dina Maru, immigration attorney. Like, thank you so much for stopping by and giving us some education and some much needed information on this topic.
Definitely.
And we'd love to talk to you again down the road.
Thank you.
Once again, do not forget, ladies and gentlemen, to click on the bell icon to notify you when we post new videos. And as always, don't forget to watch out for the full details of this week's story published on our campaign project website.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Bye for now. Stay safe. We'll talk to you next week. Stop Now, a social experiment enterprise.